Okay. Hello everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar today. We're just taking a little bit of a slow start as people are continuing to stream in. So thanks for wherever you're joining. As you see, we are in webinar mode today. So we would really welcome if you were a bit active in the chat. If you open the chat function, you have space there in which you can say hello, share where you are joining us from, and of course, ask questions during our conversation or at the end of it. I'm Deb. I'm joining from Central Italy. I'm a moderator and facilitator with the International Association of Facilitators, and I had the privilege to follow this, the process that led to the report and to the celebration of this report today. So I'm going to be your host. I'm going to take care of the technical side of things. So please do let me know if anything is not working, and I'll keep my eye on the chat and offer up some questions to our speakers. So here to introduce the day and to give us a little bit of a framing is Luis Puerto, who's the factory director from the EIT Urban Mobility. So I'm going to ask Luis to join us, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm going to share my screen to show you some introduction to today's webinar. First of all, thank you everyone for attending this webinar, panelists and audience. I'm Luis Puerto, Director of Future Mobility Factory. And on behalf of EIT Urban Mobility, I welcome you all to this webinar today. This webinar, of course, is about micromobility and how can we boost its use and its benefits in cities for the benefit of citizens, for the benefit of businesses as well, and of course, for the planet by leveraging different levers that we have, namely safety and multimodal integration, like two key aspects that we have identified that are important and relevant for a better uptake of micromobility in cities. What you can see on screen now is the cover of the report that has been conducted in the past month of September, two in-depth sessions that were held with different expert entities that you can see on screen now. We had in these in-depth workshops on micromobility research institutions like Fraunhofer Institute, DECRA Digital. We had the cities of Amsterdam and Budapest, businesses like Spin Mobility and Achmea Insurance Group, startups supported by EIT Urban Mobility like Fluctuo, public transport operators like MVV from Munich, and also, last but not least, international policy research institutions like the International Transport Forum or the FIA. So these were the protagonists of the workshops and the ones that draw the recommendations and conclusions from this report. And of course, I invite you all to download this report. And for that, you can go to our marketplace at the EIT Urban Mobility, where we feature innovative and sustainable mobility products, but we also provide insights. And in the insight section, you will be able to see the main conclusions of these workshops and the recommendations, which I will not go into depth, of course, because this is what this webinar is going to be about. So I hope you will enjoy the next 45 minutes and listen to the protagonists and the interesting insights they have to share with us. So I give back the word now to Debbie to get this webinar started. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luis, for setting the scene. And I'll also be the one to remind that, yes, we have about 40 more minutes to spend together. And I'm going to ask all our speakers to show up and so that we can introduce you. I know that, whoops. And here we go. Okay, so today we are joined by Gergely Kofran from the Budapest Transit Authority, by Filippo Brunelleschi, Country Manager for Spain and Portugal for SPIN, and by Alexander Santacreu, Policy Analyst for the International Transport Forum. And Debbie Decker from the City of Amsterdam should be joining us shortly. She's having some internet connection problems. So the intention here is to have a conversation, and we hope a lively discussion, and share your insights from this experience and in general about safety and micromobility adaptation. And so I'm wondering if, just to kickstart, if we'd like to do a little round of introductions and maybe how your experience with writing this paper and being part of this process was. And I guess I'll go the other way around from how I introduced you. Alexander, would you like to start?
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. It was also great to take part in the workshop, because it put the industry, as you said earlier, the industry, the think tanks, the policymakers together in the same room. Which and to introduce myself a bit, this is something we did fairly recently at the ITF when we developed the Safe Micromobility report. We had all those partners in the same room, and that produced some very useful insights. So we just refreshed that with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And from, I don't know, city perspective, Gergely, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks. I'm Gergely Kofran. I'm a project manager for shared mobility initiatives of BKK, the City Transit Authority of Budapest. And we are actually actively working on creating the necessary regulation for shared micromobility providers and later on shared mobility providers within Budapest to operate optimally in line with the city's directives for future transport. So this webinar and this workshop was very useful for me. I would also like to highlight that it put different kind of stakeholders together, which is always useful for information sharing, especially in a relatively new field. Shared mobility, shared micromobility has very recently started to become a big player in the mobility space. So we kind of need all the help we can get to make heads or tails of what's happening and to identify possible best practices. The report plays a big part in that. I think it has some really useful and interesting recommendations and perspectives, and also this webinar would I think deepen the perspective of everyone attending on this topic.
Thank you. Of course, Filippo.
Hi, Deborah. Many thanks, first of all, for inviting us once again. And the panel has been very interesting last time, and the workshop itself, and also the paper we believe is very relevant. So I'm Filippo Ruleschi, the country manager, as you just mentioned, of SPIN Mobility, which is the mobility, sustainable, urban, and connected and electric, I would say, and sustainable of Ford Motor Company. We have been obviously working a lot on safety when we as Ford decided to come into the micromobility sector. We analyzed which were the major problems that the deployment of this new technology and this new sustainable mobility solution created, and along obviously with all the benefits and solution that we not only recognize, but we can prove analytically and with data. But we also effectively saw that there was some issues to be addressed about parking and about safety. And we leverage a lot on the experience of Ford as OEMs and manufacturer with all the ADAS system that we have. But we look at the micromobility and say, okay, this is very powerful. They can definitely help cities to transition to a more sustainable lifestyle. But we definitely need to progress with data, and we need to progress with a bit more safety than what we have seen so far. So that is the workshop itself was very interesting to discuss advantages and disadvantages of all technologies and the technologies applied to implement this mobility solution without all the problems, obviously.
Yeah. Thanks for that brief round, which really touched upon the, I guess, core topics of this paper, right? Working together across silos and working on sharing information so that those barriers to safety and to adoption can actually be overcome. So safety on the one hand and integration are the big topics in this small but very concise and to the point report. which, by the way, people joining can, I'll just remind you, you have in the chat the link if you're interested in downloading the report. So safety and integration are the topics we're going to be talking about today, maybe dedicating about half of our time to one and half of our time to the other. So since Filippo was touching on the topic of data, I thought we might maybe want to start with that. And please, whoever feels like picking up these questions, just unmute yourself and pick it up. I've also had the experience of being confused by the number of apps and services and different data streams going on, in particularly in big cities. So I was wondering what the outcome is for you. What can private and public players do to make it more convenient for users like me to use micromobility, and maybe combining it with other services? What would you like to share about that topic? I'm going to just leave the floor open and see if Filippo would like to say something.
Yeah, so obviously, as I stated once again in the workshop, we always or frequently speak about the work that has to be done between private and public. I believe that on the private side, there has been a lot of progress in many markets, or like a general technical advance of the technology and solution. Whereas on the regulation side, we are still struggling to see some movement. And whichever movement we see is also frequently not go into the data direction. That's why, I mean, probably one of the goals of a report like this one is to try to establish a conversation with the authorities to speak about data and data related decision. In Spain these days is still there is a big discussion about the mandatory helmets on scooters, and meanwhile we are obviously always recommending the use of helmets. We also should speak more about data. So what is the data that has fueled this decision? And I mean, during the workshop, we looked at the ITF report on micromobility. We look at data about accidents, but not only accident fatalities. And we didn't pull out any data that is that relevant about helmets, for example, for this kind of solution. Whereas we saw that infrastructure, even light infrastructure, can be a lot more impactful in terms of proactive safety. Then obviously we speak about safety as general term, but it is active and passive safety. Helmet is always a passive safety equipment, whereas infrastructure or a system like the one that we presented during the workshop and is well described in the paper with camera ADAS, this is preventive actually, because it's try to avoid the crash. You know, we know crashes are predictable frequently, so we can just work in that direction, try to prevent. So generally takeaway, there is still a lot of data. We still have a lot of data, and we do produce a huge amount of data. The gap now, or the barrier, or the obstacle now, is to let the administration to validate the data, interpret the data, analyze the data, understand the data. There is, and we are trying to bring it down, and all these sort of papers. I was referring to the ITF reports of 2019 on micromobility as the Bible of the micromobility regarding safety. And that is true. I mean, we can bring up data, and when frequently political decisions are made just by pressure.
Filippo talked about the safety data implications. I would like to talk a bit about the other topic regarding data, about integrating micromobility and increasing their adoption. What we've seen based on international examples is that there's a data standard, the MDS, the mobility data specification standard that's developed, which is a kind of the standard of how shared mobility and in that shared micromobility providers give data to public authorities, which allow them to actually monitor their activities and help enforce any regulation that's in place. So in Budapest, we are also working towards that, to have control over the data of shared micromobility providers. Filippo also touched upon a bit about the helmet question regarding safety, and I'm very glad that he mentioned that there are other measures, including the infrastructure, that could be very helpful in reducing danger towards the users of micromobility. Here in Budapest, we kind of have the philosophy to avoid picturing micromobility as a sport that's dangerous and things like that, in order to increase the adoption. So what we are focusing on are the other kind of safety measures. We have a sustainable urban mobility plan where we have targets set to lower the traffic within the inner city and the city in general. Lower traffic means a safer environment for any micromobility user to use the actual road infrastructure, not just the dedicated bike lanes, for example. So that's the direction we're going in, and the helmet is actually a very specific thing that makes it look like you're doing something dangerous, you're doing a sport. So if we think of micromobility as a way for sustainable mobility and something that decreases the traffic in a city, we try to avoid having this mental image in people's heads. Since it's the lower speed spectrum of using micromobility, where we are not actively advocating for helmet usage, this is the everyday use of micromobility, where you actually use your bike, for example, to go to work and go home. So that's the type of thing which we wouldn't like to picture as a sport or something dangerous.
There is a lot of discussion about the real usage of scooters, and I think that is very much connected once again to regulation. Recently, we're in Barcelona together with the EIT, the International Forum of Tomorrow of Mobility. And we look at data, for example, in a city like Barcelona. So Barcelona is a greenwashing regulation on low emission zone, because basically it's not really a low emission zone, since it allows 20-year-old cars to still access the city. And meanwhile, there is no shared service for scooter. And funny enough, there is also a regulation that forbid public or private users of scooters to take the scooters on public transportation during the peak hours. So basically, they are doing zero regulation to sort of reduce the traffic and the heavy pollution and the inefficiency of the traffic with an efficient usage of cars. Whereas they basically create more, they do not create regulation to share mobility, and they create regulation that stops the implementation of these alternative mobility solutions. So when we look at the global picture of a city like Barcelona, then we say, okay, here it clearly doesn't work. It seems that it doesn't work, but the data that we pull out is basically driven by a regulation that is clearly focused on not creating sustainable mobility solution. I mean, Barcelona is very much behind than many other cities in Europe. And the regulation that are pulling out from the city are more and more going into that direction. I mean, so once again, when we look at data, we should look at data with a very broad vision, and we should just sit down with regulators and try to implement a regulation that allow data-driven decision. So, and the sport itself is not really a sport, and there is always a portion that in a cities like Tarragona, where we launched first the service, and it's like a new city for shared mobility solution, we have seen that 0.05% of the trips basically have this kind of usage and create a lot of problems, but it's just 0.05% of the trips, of the overall trips. So there is a lot of usage that is a healthy usage, and then there is a little bit of misusage. But then if we extrapolate this to car usage, then we see probably a 40% of misusage, bad parking, inefficient usage of the vehicle, and unsafe unsafe driving. I mean, once again, looking at data, recently a paper here in Madrid did a test on the speeding since in May of this year. The city or the national level, all urban roads are now limited to 30 kilometers per hour, but they only apply 2 traffic fines to people that is going over 30 in Madrid, whereas like 80–90% of the people still goes above, whereas they apply like 150,000 fines to scooters. So when we once again look at data, we should try to on one side, it's very evident what the political will is, okay, not allow this kind of solution, and on the other side, even help the usage of cars, which is going backwards basically. But then on the other side, okay, if this is the political will, then really, even if you give the regulator a lot of data, a lot of very well and thoughtful and very well structured data, then you need to have the political will to do something with that data.
There's an admin question about.
Okay, so sorry to step in like that, but you've mentioned data. We've mentioned the Bible of data for road safety, and I saw Alexander maybe wanted to step in with some more clarity, maybe about that. I'm not really. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I see it starts. We inevitably talk about safety very quickly in the conversation about micromobility, which is a good thing. But I've got very big fears. My fear is that we spend the whole webinar talking about helmets, and my fear is that we spend the next couple of years talking about helmets again. I agree with Gergely. Riding an e-scooter or bicycle is not a sport, is not a dangerous activity. It's part of daily life. It's like walking. And our ITF report concludes that riding an e-scooter is not more dangerous, is not more likely to kill you than riding a bike. And it's 5 times less likely to kill you than making a motorcycle ride, taking a ride on a motorbike, which many people do still, with not much public debate about. So I wanted to clarify that, because the more we talk about helmet regulations, the less we talk about the things that matter. Protected space for people to walk or to be on 2 wheels, lower speeds where they need to be lowered, where we inherited higher speeds from previous decades when our priorities were different at the time. And so reflecting on what happened on the last couple of years, I am very positive for that industry, for micromobility as a whole, because cities have changed. Through the pandemic, they have created protected space very, very rapidly. We've seen a shortage of bikes in bike shops. So there is a whole enthusiasm in the entire world for choosing light mobility options, whether they are owned or shared. These are different debates which we could dwell on. But yeah, I wanted to take a positive spin on micromobility to start this webinar.
Thank you so much. I have on right here the recommendations that emerge from the paper, and the first one is deploying protected cycle lanes, right, and lanes for micromobility. And then there's some other interesting topics in there about service level agreements, about setting criteria for service for cities. That maybe leads us a bit to this question that I'm not sure if it's the one you were pointing to, Gergely, about how can micromobility services help public transport authorities to help solve that first and last mile problem?
Yeah, I can give an answer to that, at least to what we are thinking right now. We try to treat micromobility as kind of an extension of the public transport system. And exactly this first and last mile problem is where they can be useful. So we are trying to create at first micromobility points, then maybe even mobility stations at large mobility hubs, where people can transfer from a micromobility vehicle to regular public transport. And also another important thing here would be the integration of these services. In Germany, I think it already happened in some cities. For example, Berlin has this Jelby application, which is we consider as a very good practice, and we are trying to move towards that as well, where the services, the micromobility services that are provided, most of the shared ones, can be accessible via one central application, which is preferably under the city transport authority. So there could even be like tariff integration, but also this service integration where it's where micromobility is an extension of the regular public transport network that could convince people to use them and help get people on the tram, metro lines and things like that. So that's what we're working towards, and in the next few years we're very excited to see whether real life the firms are hypothesis or not.
I like Alexandre positive spin on the conversation about micromobility. And once again, we understand data from the point of view of the ITF, but also to back up it once again with data, the discussion that was engaged or was starting Gergely. We did recently a study with Kantar on population in different cities in Spain, even where there is no shared mobility solution. And more than 70%, almost 80% of the population answered that they would use even more public transportation system if there were a shared mobility solution that connects the famous last mile of the ride. So that is also one input. And in cities like Madrid, I mean, we are working actively with the EMT to try to integrate the open ticketing is always something that may be interesting for all parties. We need to overcome some sort of complexity on the development of the integration, even if we have API level 3. But everything can be done. There needs to be a mid to long-term plan in order to make this viable for everyone.
And what could be interesting for the customers, for the traveling public, is that the micromobility industry sets expectations regarding service level. Let me give you an example. If I travel to a remote part of my metropolitan area by public transport, how can I be reassured that there will be a bike there? There will be an e-scooter waiting for me? Is there a service level agreement, or can I just book it in advance so that one is locked for me and is in good shape, rideable? Otherwise, I would not trust public transport system as a whole, and I will take a car or a taxi.
Makes sense. Probably the service level agreement is what best may define this kind of service. Once again, I mean, the micromobility sector has been doing a lot of investments. I mean, we speak about the technology of the safety, and once again, we categorize a scooter as a bicycle, but there is nothing that prevents a mechanical bicycle to go 40 kilometers per hour downhill. So theoretically, the scooter is much, much, much safer than bicycle, because the lower the speed, the better results we see on fatalities and data on accidents. But still, we did a lot of advancement. We put a lot of technology. There are huge investments that us on the private sector are doing. What we need is a more mature approach from regulators to create this famous service level agreement. We can advise. I mean, a lot of companies that even not like operators, like provider of data that they're doing these services. They're doing as consultant for the cities to advise on better or worse regulation they could do. But if we say, okay, in a city like Paris, if there is some sort of intervention from the public in order to support the investments that the private is doing, or if there is like a long-term plan for the operators, then you can have a viable product and you can extend the service area. Translating in normal terms is, if big cities like Madrid, Paris, London is doing a tender for just 2 operators that last 5 to 10 years, then all sort of implementation can be done. But then we need to work very well on data and distribution of the fleet. And if there is some sort of subsidy that can come also from the city. It does happen with bike sharing. Why shouldn't it happen on scooter sharing? So if there is a very mature approach from the regulator point of view, and if we look at long term instead of this rush of that's probably been fueled by all these startups that came out with a low capex barrier that is setting a very low access standard, then we could have like a more mature conversation with cities. But we are always open. Once again, the extension to give the service to public users to reach the very last house in the urban area of a big city can be done. We need a critical mass of critical volume of scooters, or minimum volume of scooters, or number of scooters per square kilometer. It can be done, but then the less the usage, the more subsidy we need to receive, or the operator would have to face as cost.
I see a very interesting question from Henry. How can public transport authorities manage the costs of the integration, since public transport users are usually low and middle income, and sometimes the shared services have a higher price than those of the PT ride? That's a very interesting question. And at first, I would like to challenge the first part of the question. For example, here in Budapest, we see this as a way to make public transport more attractive to those with a high income as well. Mainly where we can compete is time, because no matter what your income, you have the same 24 hours per day. And in larger cities where the traffic is very dense in the inner city areas, public transport can actually be can actually mean a shorter trip. And if we use these micromobility solutions for first and last mile problems, that could increase the speed very much, because the time you lose on public transport is usually when you get to the big metro line or tram line, and when you get to your final destination from the last stop. And if that first and last mile travel becomes much faster, because you don't need to walk anymore, you can just grab, for example, an e-scooter or a bike next to the metro station. You will be 5 times faster than if you walk that last mile. Maybe in practice it's less than 5 times, but still it's a very, very meaningful speed difference. So this way we are trying to make public transport look more attractive to high-income people as well, who might not have a problem with the price. And also the second solution could be this tariff integration, where just from the economies of scale, for example, if we as a BKK provide access to, for example, e-scooter companies, that people using our app, which is like a third of the city's population, can purchase like a bundled access with the regular public transport service. We bundle access to the e-scooter services. The price of it can be lower than the regular market price because of the sheer volume of people who might use it, and this might be okay for the company as well. So we could use this economies of scale, and in the long term, it's also because these companies are market companies. They are striving for innovation and managing costs, and in the long term, their costs might decrease even, so that they could sell their services at a lower price. So we are trying not to put a lot of burdens on them, either administratively or financially. in order to make this possible, that eventually maybe their prices decrease as well. So that's my answer to that question.
Thanks so much, Gergely, for picking that up and giving such a thorough answer. I see that we only have about 5-6 minutes to end, and now that's getting scary for me because there could be so much more to say. And I would like, just before to close, I would like to ask you all a question about the future. But just before that, I see there's a question coming from the audience that is really probably very much for Filippo, about technology and about how to use technology to detect incompliances. And it's coming from Irene. She was asking, do you think ITS has an important role to play in micromobility safety and also in informing better planning and regulation? Would Filippo or any other of you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So technology, as we stated, as it is very well described in the paper, we have technology nowadays on our scooter with camera, front-facing camera that is like a real-time recognition of where it rides or if it encounters obstacles and these things. So we can when I was speaking before about the proactive safety or active safety, so we can prevent accident, we can prevent people from riding on sidewalks or on pedestrian areas. This is preventive technology, and it already exists. It's very well described on the paper, and it's basically the main approach that we had when we started looking at micromobility. So how to solve the problem with technology. The technology part is already there now. Once again, we are working a lot on PA these days because once the technology part is sorted, then we need to concentrate on the regulation.
Thank you. So I promised a last question, and I'm thinking of something looking about the future. So combining all these aspects of regulation and city interventions and the private sectors, like how can we make sure that it works? How can we make sure that micromobility services operating in the cities actually contribute to these goals and are in lines with what us as citizens need? Perhaps Alexander, you'd like to give some perspective on that. Thank you.
To put it simply, I'd say we are near the end of the path of acceptance. That was a long and bumpy road. You just have to read the news for that. But we will enter a new path, a very complicated path that Gergely started describing, the path of integration. But that could bring tremendous benefits to the traveling public and to public transport as a whole. That's complex, but that's going to be the new agenda for the next few years. And innovation is that will be not so much about technology than about working together between the industry and the transport authorities. I think that's the main challenge.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more as a facilitator and moderator that working together is the main challenge. And Gergely and Filippo, anything you'd like to add about using future barriers we need to overcome and how we'll do it?
Well, I on one side hope that all countries would align with Alex's vision on we have passed the implementation phase. In many countries, we are still in trying to convince public and cities that this is a viable solution. And once again, we never stated that micromobility is the solution for everything and for all. We are a car manufacturer, so at the end of the day, we believe that all sorts of mobility solutions, they have their own use case. We just wouldn't like to see a future where the car or the inefficient use of the car that is taking space, that is not used, and is the pollution and everything else is predominant over all the other solutions.
I agree with what Alexander and Filippo said. Other than that, maybe a thought about the connection between adoption and safety of micromobility. So in order to increase the adoption, the safety needs to be on a good level as well. However, it's not only the actual safety, but the perception of safety. too. So if there are currently a lot of beliefs or maybe misbeliefs that people who use micromobility are active risk takers, mostly male, mostly young. However, there are other target groups with maybe different risk appetite, and we need to make sure that micromobility suits their needs as well. And not only by providing the necessary regulation and infrastructure to be able to use micromobility safely, but also to provide an image of this mobility mode that it's not like a sport, but it's as Alexander said, like walking, like something that you do in your everyday life.
Yes, I feel like I'm one of those target people myself. I use an electric bike, and I would definitely appreciate it if my mid-sized city were safer. It would probably convince more of my friends to follow me. Also, if it rained a little bit less, but I can't do anything about that. So I really want to thank you for your generosity in answering, and I'm going to call in on Johan from EIT Urban Mobility, who has organized this process and put together the report, to perhaps take the floor for a few closing remarks. And also,
thank you, Deborah. Yeah, from the side of EIT Urban Mobility, I would say really a big thank you for first the panelists for the moderation, Deborah, of the webinar. Also, we really acknowledge the contribution of experts actually who helped us during a structured process from a workshop to the paper and to several events like this webinar, in terms of disseminating the knowledge that we created. I think the discussion today was, of course, could have gone on and on and on, but I think we touched really about the two main pillars that we actually address in the paper. So the safety aspect, so the data and integration aspects. So that can give you a very good glimpse actually at what we tackle in more depth in the report. Also, a big thank you for the audience for all the questions, very targeted, very well informed. So I think we really had like a good discussion here. And then looking ahead, stay tuned for further EIT Urban Mobility reports on trends in mobility. We will have upcoming webinars for sure with a similar format. And so we are really looking forward to welcome you there once we organize them. So yeah, thank you again for attending.
Jan, this is a technical question coming again from the chat. Is this recording going to be shared? Do you know already how and where?
So it will be on our YouTube channel, but I cannot venture to tell you a date now. So we'll do our best to put it as quickly as possible. But then it can be accessed on our EIT Urban Mobility YouTube channel.
Thank you. And I see there's a question coming now on pedestrians. Now we are closing. So, but Gergely, if you have, okay, you really want to answer it, go.
A very short answer. This is actually a big concern for us as well. What we'd like to do is to not allow and promote these the usage of these micromobility vehicles on pedestrian sidewalks. But rather we would like them to use similar infrastructure as bicycles do. And that's not only dedicated bike lanes, but also the general road infrastructure, if it is made to be safer for micromobility users, both bike and other micromobility users. In the long-term sustainable urban mobility plan, yes, we have speed reduction and also traffic reduction goals. If those are reached, even the regular roads will be much more suitable to use these vehicles, and it will be less attractive to use them on the sidewalks.
Yeah, once again, I mean, this question really touched my heart. It very much depends on, as Gergely was saying, on the infrastructure. Would say on the education on one side, but on the infrastructure. I mean, in cities, once again, where we see that there is no infrastructure, or even the infrastructure is very well structured. I mean, Barcelona, once again, the vast majority of the bike lane are just painted on sidewalks. So, and there is no physical barrier. That is basically a solution that create even more problem with pedestrians rather than create a solution. So if we think about, you know, on one side, we felt now after the COP26, the new term of greenwashing came to the general public, but there is also one part which is the safe washing. I mean, when everyone is speaking about safety, but then the implementation of the safety measure that is put in place is very much not what the data or the logic would or should drive.
I wanted to ask Alexander's opinion as a road safety expert, but I saw he applauded. So, so you'll stick to that. Okay, so thank you again so much, everybody in the audience, everybody at Urban Mobility, and all of our speakers, and Debbie, who unfortunately couldn't join today, but was very instrumental in writing the report, as well as all the other experts that are mentioned there. So thank you to everybody. Stay safe, you know, stay safe and build safe infrastructure. And I guess keep in touch with the EIT Urban Mobility and with next developments from the Transport Forum and everybody else here. Okay, so stay safe and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.